This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Beyond the Big Screen. We are joined yet again by Frank Scalise, an author, former police officer. You should be well acquainted with Frank because he has been a multi-time guest. But maybe, Frank, give us a quick introduction before we dive into the topic of today.
Well, my Beyond the Big Screen nickname is supposed to be Triple Threat, I think. That's what we decided, right?
I like it.
As you mentioned, I had a career in law enforcement for 20 years. I was an officer in Spokane, Washington, is in the eastern part of the state there. Spokane's a mid-sized city, about 300 officers. I retired as a captain, and I was fortunate in my career to have done the job for about the first half of my career, and then I kind of stumbled backwards into a leadership position. And so the second half of my career, I was focused on leadership roles. And in those leadership roles, I pretty much got to lead the different units that I didn't experience as a line member. And so that was great for my career because I really enjoyed it, and I got exposed to a lot of things that also benefited me in my other role, and that is as an author. I've been writing since I was a kid, but I've been a published author since 2006. Well, 2004, if you start counting short stories. And mostly I write in the crime genre. Probably about 2/3 of my work is in the crime genre under the pen name of Frank Zafiro. I also write in science fiction and fantasy as Frank Zafiro. In fact, you interviewed me about my science fiction novel, Kemper's House, on this very program.
Yeah, and so today we're going to discuss one of your latest novels, at least one of the latest at this point when we're recording. It's called Silence of the Dead, and it's within the Charlie 316 series, who you wrote with your co-author, Colin Conway. I think at this point to discuss this book, maybe we'll go on kind of the meta of your writing process and then the meta of this universe that you created in the Charlie 316, because it's a little different than some of the other fiction that you've done. And then we'll dive into some of the specifics in a conversation about the book. One thing that I'll apologize for is that I introduced you at one point when you were on it as a true crime author, which that is definitely not what you are. I'd love to talk a little bit about, obviously true crime is nonfiction, but it really does take a narrative approach to it in most true crime. But then you're writing crime fiction, and reading more crime fiction, I see that they're really two entirely different genres, even if you ignore that true crime is nonfiction. What do you think the difference is to you between true crime and crime fiction? And then maybe why do you eschew true crime?
So in true crime, I think you're taking real events and you're trying to find a cohesive narrative in there, and you're trying to nudge it towards something that is entertaining because it's already interesting, or you wouldn't want to write about it. I mean, the case already has some interesting elements to it. And so you're trying to nudge it towards the fictional so that it is more palatable in an entertainment sense, or more digestible, more consumable. And I think on the crime fiction side, you're taking a story that you made up that's interesting to you, or you wouldn't be writing it. And you're writing it in a way that nudges it towards the more realistic, so that those people who, want some genuine, authentic sort of, police elements to their fiction are getting that. And so they're almost like starting on opposite sides of the line and pushing towards the center, which is that, realism. And they're just coming at it from, opposite sides. I think the best true crime is told in a very narrative sense. I have a colleague who writes crime fiction named Eric Pruitt, who did a great long form podcast, about 8 episodes, I think, called The Long Dance, about a true crime story. And he's also a filmmaker. And obviously, like I mentioned, he's written a number of books and short stories, edits a particular, he edits a magazine called Dark Yonder. Just a great guy, great storyteller. And so when he delves into true crime, he's telling a story, even though it's not fictional. And I think that's the best approach for that. My wife loves true crime. She watches true crime stuff, documentaries on streaming services and stuff. It's a little too much of a busman's holiday for me, and it always was. And so I also like the fact that I can control the story to a degree in fiction. And so rather than going out and trying to find an interesting story that I then would have to write about in a mostly factual way, to me, it's much more appealing to say, what if, and then run with it and create a fictional story instead. So that's really more my cup of tea. But, I think if I wanted to make some serious money, I'd go into true crime, because I think there might be more of an opportunity there.
Yeah, actually, Mustache Chris and I, somebody contacted us about a true crime that he was involved in, that there was a situation, and we talked with the guy for like 3 hours, and Chris and I were thinking like maybe we could turn this into a couple of episode series, but I personally got overwhelmed with the fact that you have to make some sort of narrative out of it, and it seemed very difficult to do that. And I think that to really do it well, you have to do a lot of research.
Yeah.
You're basically turning into an investigator yourself, and that 100%. Is not an easy task.
Yeah, you have to be an investigative journalist essentially to do a good job of it. Certainly, if you have a policing background, your investigative abilities could come to bear as well. And so it's probably not as easy as people think. I think it was Mark Twain that said, easy reading is damn hard writing. So you know what that's all about. And I think it's the same when you present true crime, and they make it look really seamless, and they make it look really coherent, and they make it look very smooth. But I think the actual process is probably very difficult, and there's a lot of research that has to be done, and a lot of puzzle pieces put together. And that's not even to speak of all of the legalities that come up there, what you can and can't use, and, what's public information and what's privileged, privacy, and, that kind of stuff that comes up. And fortunately with fictional characters, I might violate their privacy, but they can't sue me for it because they're fictional.
Yes, exactly. Now, you wrote this series, so this entire series, the Charlie 316 series, in which Silence of the Dead is one of the books in it. You wrote it, you're writing it, the series, with your co-author. And I wonder, before we dig into the content of the series in the book, what is it like writing with a co-author?
Well, it's different with every co-author. I've written books with 5 different people, and while there are similarities in each of those, every single one of them was a very different experience. And I would equate it, sometimes when I'm giving talks on collaboration, I do presentations on it sometimes, and I inevitably end up comparing it to a friendship, or even better, a marriage, in that, if you've been married more than once, every marriage is different. If you talk to different married couples, every marriage is different. And I think every business relationship is different. And so sometimes we kind of did our own thing and then got together and hashed it out after it was mostly done. Other times we, started at the drawing board, pen in hand together, and so that's just one small example. Colin is the only person that I'm still currently collaborating with. And that's not because the other ones didn't work out. They just ran their course. In a couple of instances, the series that we were working on, we finished. And so series is finished, and, and we never came up with an idea that was one that we wanted to work on again. So we haven't worked together again. so the way Colin and I work together is very collaborative. It's very much 50-50. We start at the idea phase, pen in hand, drawing easel empty and ready to write on. And we share that process from the very beginning in almost every case. And so it's 50-50 all the way.
Can you give us a little overview of this series? Because this series, the setting is in the real world, Spokane, Washington, which is a little different than some of your other books that are set in a fictional town, which is kind of based on Spokane. Maybe you can tell us the genesis of this series and give us a little overview on it.
Yeah, it is set in a fictional version of Spokane, obviously, but it is set in Spokane. My River City series is my main series, and that's a very thinly veiled Spokane. And I've written other series set in different versions of Spokane. I think there's like 4 different versions of the city throughout all of my fiction. This series is kind of interesting because the genesis of it was Colin called me up and said, "Hey, I got this great idea for a book. I want to set it in Spokane, and I want it to be about an officer involved shooting. But I want to kind of flip the script a little bit. It's almost always, when it causes a scandal, it's almost always a white officer has shot a minority, usually a black person. And, in Spokane, it's like 87% white. And so that's probably the way it would happen there too, just because, there's the population of the black population in Spokane is like 2.5-3%. It's pretty small minority of, and so he thought it would make people have to think about the situation a little bit differently if we flip the script. And if it was a black officer, particularly a really solid officer who's, tactically solid, who's a stand-up person in the community, who's well respected, who shoots a white person on a traffic stop, and then scandal erupts, and how would that look? Would it look different? What would look different, and how would people respond, or would it be exactly the same? No difference. Let's explore it. And I thought that was a fascinating idea. And he said, "Well, I want to work on it with you because, like, there are aspects of this kind of an event that I just don't have any experience in. And then I was a captain during my career, and I was familiar with what happens in an officer involved shooting scenario, and what goes on in command staff meetings and things like this. And Colin had experience as a police officer, and he had experience in the union, but he didn't have any command experience. And he'd been a cop for 5 years, and I'd been one for 20. So he felt like between the two of us, there was a pretty good reservoir of experience there that we could draw on to make it a compelling story."
Now, in this particular book, it traces a crime and a series of crimes that start in the early 1950s. And it's a retrospective from an author, or from a investigator, a police detective who's trying to churn over a cold case. And the book is dipping in and out of the narrative taking place in the time and then going back to the present day. And I thought, to me, that the thing that, and I don't know if it was a theme that you were going for, or it's just something that I personally grabbed onto, is this difference in eras, that every single era that they go into, the 1950s to the early 1970s to the early 2000s, the early aughts of the 2000s, that the culture had changed. But when you're jumping in and out, you can see that the culture just didn't abruptly change at each one of these things. It really, truly did evolve. And I think you, as a former policeman, you would have seen that in your career, and even in teaching, where you work in a big institution. These institutions, they don't change very fast, but they certainly do change. And one of my first questions is, how did you tap into that? Because it seemed very real to me. I don't know. I wasn't a policeman in 1951, but it felt very real to me, of how they operated and the outlooks of the cops during that time period. Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History podcast and many other great shows. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors.
Yeah, it was a challenge in that I wasn't alive in 1951. I was a kid in 1974. I did work. I was working cop in 2005. So that was one I could draw on direct experience from. And I haven't been a cop since 2013. So, the tentpole scenes in the present day are also, a period that I've not directly experienced as a police officer. This series, this is the sixth book in the series technically, but the first four books in it are kind of a meta arc. We call it the Tyler Garrett saga. And then after that, when we started writing just books set in that universe, it's not necessarily a direct continuation of the previous book's story. And yet, the characters, many of the characters in this book are characters that exist in the, through earlier in the series. And what we wanted to really bring out was that evolution of the viewpoints that maybe the public had, and maybe that certain officers had, and we made sure to show a wide range. Because people think, well, cops in this era thought like this. Well, not all of them, right? In the first section in 1951, the two partners, they differ in age. They differ in which war they fought in. The older one, George Amherst, fought in the First World War, and now he's, nearing the end of his career, while Pierce is in the first decade or so of his career. And he served in the Second World War. And so, they had, different viewpoints on a lot of things, including leadership, including the public, including how policing should be done, including the question of things like graft, how people should be treated, how you should treat the public, and so forth. And so we just kind of looked at what the spectrum might be in that area and time frame wise, and went with it. There's a little bit of a sidebar here, but did you ever see the Demi Moore movie? Harvey Keitel's in it as well, called Mortal Thoughts.
I don't believe so.
Bruce Willis is in it as well, and Glenn Headley. It's a good movie. I recommend it. And it had a device in there that I always liked, and I always kind of wanted to employ in a book if it organically fit. And that is that a large portion of the movie is anchored by a police interview. Harvey Keitel and his partner, I don't remember who that is, interviewing Demi Moore, interviewing Glenn Headley, these two best friends, who are the primary two characters in the story. Bruce Willis plays the husband of Demi Moore, plays the husband of, I think it's Demi Moore. I forget. I haven't seen it in a long time, because what I remember from it was the interview between Harvey Keitel and especially Demi Moore, but also Glenn Headley. And so they're in the box, they're in the interrogation room, and they show large sections of them talking, and then they will, fade into narrative storytelling where they'll show what it is that Demi Moore is describing, and I always thought that was really nicely done. Yeah, I liked that technique. And so when it came time to do this book, I thought, there needs to be something in the present day that's the reason why we're having this conversation about what happened in the past. And so that's why a character from the first four books had a very large role, Detective Wardell Clint. He's grabbed onto some tenuous but possibly very real connections between a whole bunch of cases, and he's kind of trying to dig up the past, and he does so with a retired chief who has some direct knowledge, and then some institutional knowledge, some I heard it from so-and-so type of knowledge that Clint can combine with what's in the official record and what's in the official case files and so forth. And so that's why, each of these three time periods is anchored down, is kind of tent poled by a scene with Clint and the retired Chief Baumgartner. And that the inspiration for that came from the idea of mortal thoughts. And then the other big inspiration for this, it was kind of an odd situation to spark a book, but I used to live in the country. And so I was driving out of town going home, and all along a highway just outside of Spokane on Highway 2, I saw a hitchhiker one day, and he was, at least 60, maybe could have been in his 70s. I wouldn't have at all been surprised if he was in his 70s, but he, had a backpack on. His clothes were not filthy, but they were rugged, and he had kind of a weathered look to him. And, he looked like a guy that lived pretty rough, and he had his thumb out, and it wasn't blazing hot summer. It wasn't yet, super cold. It was like late summer, early fall. So there was no like danger of him being outside or whatever. But I still started to pull over to give him a ride, like just barely drifted a little bit in the lane thinking about it. And then I was like, what are you doing? Like, you pick up a hitchhiker? I mean, what are you, stupid? I mean, what are the odds that could turn out badly? Well, they're not as good as if you just keep driving, and the guy's not going to freeze to death or die of thirst here. If this was your daughter or your son or your wife, or if you asked me, should I pick him up? I'd be like, Steve, no, don't. Like, the guy's out there for a reason. He's made a choice. He's got a backpack. He's walking fine. Let him find his own way. It's not your problem. And the chances of something bad happening are significantly greater than if you just go on your way. That's a little jaded, a little cynical, but it's what most cops would tell you. In 2014 when this happened. Well, on the rest of the way home and for a while afterwards, I got to thinking, why? Like, I don't pick up hitchhikers. Like, if somebody's pulled over the side of the road with a broken down vehicle looking like they need help, that's the different matter, right? I'm talking about flat out hitchhikers, right? I don't pick up hitchhikers. Why am I thinking about doing it even for a second here? And I landed on the realization that's because he was older. He was 65, 75 years old. And for some reason that reduced the threat in my mind. And I got to thinking, well, if the guy was the kind of guy that would pull a knife on me, and when I picked him up and take my money or whatever, or take me out in the middle of nowhere and kill me or something. If he was the kind of guy that would do that at 35, he's still the kind of guy that would do that at 50 and at 75. So what's changed? Well, my perception of him has changed. And in this country, we kind of have this view of older people. They're cute, or they're, ineffective, or they kind of become almost invisible to a degree. And there's a character in the book who characterizes it, who says we infantilize them, and we kind of do to a degree. And I got to thinking about how that person could be every bit as dangerous, maybe not as physically capable. As we all know, when you hit about 40, some things start to change. And when you hit 50, reflexes drop a little bit and so forth. And yet, look at George Foreman, the strength is the last to go. I mean, he always had a puncher's chance. And granted, he's not 75, but that's the truth of the human anatomy, right? Your strength is the last thing to go. And so I got to thinking, what if there were a guy that had been killing people for 50 plus years and getting away with it, partially because police fall prey to this same sort of blind spot where they don't suspect somebody who's in their 60s or 70s. They're looking for somebody in their 20s, 30s, or 40s, maybe. And that sat with me for a long time. And then slowly things like this mortal thoughts, format, or structure and other aspects started coming together. And finally I was like, I want to write this, but it needs to be, someplace that makes sense. And the Charlie 316 universe was the perfect location for it. So I brought, Colin brought the idea for the first book to me, and that erupted into what ended up being that 4-book arc. And the last 2 books in the series, I brought him the idea. And so I guess I'm paying him back a little bit for bringing me on board. And so then we, I had the idea, maybe the skeleton of the idea. And then together he and I, filled out the skeleton, added the meat and the bones and the rest of the bones and the, skin, cartilage, and blood and all the rest that made up the story.
It really does make you think too, because you have we don't necessarily think about an older person continuing these crimes. And then it makes you think too, maybe the person finally does retire, because this is a good question for you. I've heard that there's some idea that people will reduce the amount of crime that they do, or like just their natural passions kind of fade out when they get into their 30s and their 40s. So that's why there's even an extreme idea that somebody who's maybe murdered when they are 18, you keep them in prison until they're in their mid 30s, and then they're much less likely to commit that crime again. But so say the person does stop committing the crimes and it's 20 or 30 or 40 years later and they're really, really old. It's hard to, at least for me, to think like, oh, we really do have to throw this person who's in their in hospice, essentially, put them through the rigmarole of the case. But I would have felt very differently of them when they were 30 or maybe 40 or even 50.
Yeah. And, I have a friend who, another writer named James Latwell, who worked in the California penal system, actually rose up to a pretty high position within that organization. And he's written a number of really good books. He doesn't actually he writes some short stories that take place in prison, but he hasn't really written any prison books. But he does talk about, his experience and his knowledge in a couple different organizations that I'm part of, and he's a good speaker. And one of the things that he points out is that, when people go into prison, time kind of stops for them. If you remember The Sopranos, do you remember that show, right?
Yeah.
You remember when the Steve Buscemi character came in season 5, the Tony Blundetto character gets out of prison, and he'd been in prison for like 20 years, and when he gets out, he comes out with the clothes that he went in on, and he's wearing like Miami Vice clothes. He looks like a Don Johnson wannabe, right? And those are still cool clothes to him, at least till he gets out and looks around. And I thought that was a really good detail, because Jim talks about how, they go in and whatever was going on when they went in, that's the stuff they talk about when they're inside mostly. And they're sort of arrested. And I mean that in the terms of like, in stasis, not slapping handcuffs on, in their development, if you will, while they're inside. I mean, not everybody and not completely, but it's a phenomenon. And so, if you put somebody in when they're 30, I think they're pretty much going to be a lot the same person when they get out when they're 50. Now, 18 to 30, maybe, most of us change a lot in that time period. So I don't know. I think a penologist or a sociologist would be better equipped to answer that question. But the point I was looking at, and the one that you make, is that, what about the difference between 50 and 70? I mean, I'm not saying people don't change over those 20 years, but I think less fundamentally than they might from 18 to 30. And certainly if they were a killer, who was a sadistic killer that drew sexual pleasure from murdering people at 50, and at 30, at 50, don't tell me that they're still not going to have something of that in their makeup at 70, and that they wouldn't be dangerous. And so Colin and I wanted to explore that. And we do. And, the case starts in 51, and it may still be going on in 2023 with Detective Clint making some connections.
One of the things that I really enjoyed is, and I think it does circle back to what you had said about this, where people, when they're in the recounting something that happened, is a very different thing than what actually happened. And I think that maybe Detective Clint is, because he wasn't there, he may not have even been a cop at the time. I don't know, because of 2023, or maybe he was just entering the force at about the time that the last bit of the story played out in 2003. He's been separate. The separation between that is a very long time. A lot of the people are long dead. And I've kind of got the feeling that he was taking what was written on the page as reality, and not maybe empathizing to what really happened, or the things that were that were written in between the lines. And the person who he was talking to, the former chief, just kept trying to coax that out of him, that not everything that was written in the report is what actually happened. Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors.
Yeah, I mean, anybody who's familiar with the first 4 books in the series, Wardell Clint is some people's favorite character, and he's a little bit obsessive, and he's a bit of a conspiracy weaver. He's a very irascible. I mean, his nickname is Honey Badger, so that'll tell you how he gets along with everybody else. But he also has his own blind spots, and if he gets his teeth into something, he's like a dog with a bone. He's not going to let go. And sometimes that's an excellent trait for a detective, but there are cases you just have to let go. I mean, like, you're not going to solve it. There's no more, you can't manufacture evidence. If it's out there, you can try to find it, but in some cases it's been destroyed or no longer exists or whatever. And so, as you mentioned, time is one of the things that obscures this case to the modern investigator, to Clint in this case. And yet, one of the things that I wanted to do was show that while it was a long time ago, I mean, 1951 to 2023, that's, 72 years. And yet, in the 1951 time period, you have an older detective and a younger detective. He's not a rookie, but he's a younger detective. When you get to 1974, the younger detective from 1951 is now the veteran nearing retirement, and you have a young officer who he's partnered with due to some interesting circumstances that took place in 1974 in Spokane. And then when you get to 2005, that younger officer from 1974 is now a lieutenant in charge of the detectives. And so the 2 detectives who are investigating in 2005, they work for that lieutenant who was the young officer in 1974. And so you can go from, and then one of those 2 investigators, one of those 2 detectives eventually became the chief, Baumgartner. So you have Clint interviewing Baumgartner, who worked for Salter, who was the younger officer in 74, partnered with Pierce, who was the younger officer, a detective rather, in 1951, partnered with Amherst. And so there is kind of a direct line back, like, you can touch a very long time ago with only a couple of, degrees of Kevin Bacon there, right?
Yeah.
And so we both wanted to convey how long the time was and how much things had changed, both physically, the personnel that are involved, the landscape of the town, the culture of the town, and yet still also convey that it's a hop, skip, and a jump if you really think about who knew who in the zoo when,
It's really interesting too how certain time periods, there's so much change so quickly. In 1951, George Amherst, they probably could have picked him up out of 1951 and made him a cop in 1901. Mm-hmm. And his life would have not been that big of very different. And that whole idea of the culture, that it was outside of his entire imagination that a cop wouldn't have been in the military and probably have served in war. Like, he would have not even considered that as being an option, where you fast forward 15 years, 20 years to George Pierce in 1971, 72 or 74. That's what I was going to say too at first. In 1974, and the world has entirely changed. The way they do the job has entirely changed. The culture has entirely changed. And I think do you think that is something that happens? Well, it certainly happens a lot faster now. Do you think that everybody, will just focus in on the police, is going to have to go through one of those time periods in their career where everything changes?
Yeah, I mean, the only constant in life is change. I mean, everything is changing constantly. That's the only thing that stays the same, is the joke, right? And it just happens usually at such an incremental fashion that that we're like the frog in the water. We don't notice it's boiling until the bubbles are popping up next to us and the steam is rising. And I think that can happen in a person's career. You come on and then 20 years later, you look back and you're like, oh my gosh. I mean, like when I came on the job, just to give you a couple of examples, when I came on the job, we drove Crown Victorias, Ford Crown Victorias. I mean, some departments drove Chevys, probably Caprices, but we drove Crown Vics. And the model was the model that had a square back end. So very square, like Adam 12 looking car, Hill Street Blues looking car. We're still driving those in the early 90s. We had a police radio, but no computer. So if you got a call, you had your report writing notebook, had a call sheet on the top of it, just basically a lined sheet. And you'd put the time that you got the call and the address and the nature of the call when they called you. And then you'd go to the call and then you'd write the disposition on there. And that was your run sheet, your call sheet. They called it different things in different eras, but that was basically, was a record of what you did on the shift. And you turn that in to your sergeant at the end of the shift, along with any other reports that you wrote. And you wrote those reports on pre-printed forms with a pen, by hand. So by the end of my career, just 20 years later, 2013, we were driving Ford Interceptors and SUVs for the most part. We'd gone from a blue and white to a black and white configuration color-wise. There was police radio, but there was also a mobile data computer in the car. And just the differences between policing with an MDC in the car and not, I could go on for 10 minutes and you'd be like, they just diametrically opposed how you're doing things, how you're getting information, how you're reporting things, all of that. So instead of getting a call on the radio, you might still, if it was a high emergency call, an in progress call that needs to be dispatched by voice, but a routine call, pop up on your computer and you read it and then you go to it. You don't tell radio you're on scene. You don't tell dispatch. You push a button and say you're on scene, record the disposition of the call in the computer. And then later on, you pull up your field reporting software and you type in, it auto populates when you pull the call in, like what date, time, location, people involved, all that kind of stuff. You double check that. And you write your narrative by typing it, maybe in the car. Most likely in the car. Maybe you get out and go into a substation and do it if it's going to be a long report. And you hit send and it goes wirelessly. And this was 2013. It's even more, sci-fi than that now. That's one small sliver of the experience that's radically different. And I think that happens across every spectrum of our experience. It happens in terms of culture. It happens in terms of the way the public views you. There's another example. Like when I came on in 93, our relationship with the public wasn't stellar. We had a chief that had done a pretty good job. And then, the Rodney King incident occurred and the riots in LA, and that had a trickle out effect across the country and certainly up into the Pacific Northwest. So, it's 3 years later and people are telling me, don't Rodney King me, and I'm like, I wasn't even a cop when that happened, but I'm getting blamed for it. And that stayed that way for quite a while. And then September 11th, 2001 happens. I was the furthest thing from at Ground Zero, right? I'm on the other side of the country. I heard about it on the radio and then on TV after. But the outpouring of support for emergency service personnel, cops and firefighters in particular, post 9/11 was huge. So then it was, thank you for your service and can I buy your coffee? And you started to have to, navigate how to say no to certain things in a way that didn't seem ungrateful because it was approaching what we would call graft and, the, inappropriate gifts, and people wanted to buy your lunch all the time. That was great. The outpouring of affection and appreciation and respect was wonderful. But that faded, that certainly faded. And then other events started to occur. And then more recently, I've been retired a number of years when it happened, but the George Floyd incident was every bit as much of a watershed moment is the Rodney King incident in terms of police history in America. And then the opposite was true. Like, people were not wanting to, sit next to the cops or near the cops. And, people immediately have evil, they assume evil intent and this sort of thing. And so, that's just from 2001, from 2001 to 2018, that's less than 20 years. You went from one extreme to the other in terms of the general view of police that a lot of people in the public have and how they interact with the police. And if you took somebody from 2003 and plopped them down in 2018, there'd be culture shock, but because it happens gradually, you adjust to it over time, but there's definitely a huge change that occurs. And we wanted to reflect that. I mean, at its heart, this is a murder mystery, right? I mean, it's a police procedural murder mystery. I mean, Amherst and Pierce are assigned a missing female, she's not a juvenile. She's a young woman. She's 18, I think. And like initially Amherst is like, this case is beneath us. I mean, it's some little trollop ran off to have fun with her friends, and we're being taken away from real police work to look for her. And eventually they discover that maybe this has got a little more meat on it and we need to be looking into it, and it becomes a murder mystery at some point. But around that core of a murder mystery, we wanted to explore the ideas of culture, the idea of the gray that exists in people and their characters. We didn't want black and white characters. We didn't want, this is the good guy and this is the bad guy. I mean, with one obvious exception, the person who's killing people. But nuance is something that we explored a lot in the previous 5 books in the Char 316 series. It was something that Colin really wanted to get into with that very first book. It was, was on the table from Jump City. And so, we definitely wanted to include that very heavily, in this book and talk about the fact that, we as a country have changed and we're not black and white. The city has changed, the department has changed, and the police officers, the individuals within it, and then the people in the community, they've all changed too. And yet there are some things that are human nature that don't necessarily change. And so this sort of dichotomy was also something that we wanted to explore.
I really thought that this book was a master's class in character development. You had the characters, you could have easily have painted George Amherst as just a run-of-the-mill 1950s, square jerk. But he really was, at least initially, he was a full 360-degree jerk. He was a jerk in many different areas of his life, and you can kind of see where you could really see where it came from. This guy would have, if you just use your imagination and some of the little bit of exposition that you dropped in the way, he was in the Great War. Therefore, he would have lived through the Depression. Therefore, being a policeman nowadays is a pretty lucrative job. They're very solidly middle class. Back then, any of these government jobs like a police, you're very scraping by to be, you're just barely into the middle class at that point. This guy lived a tough life, and he was a little bit of a womanizer at his time, and he's getting past that peak in his life where that's probably not going to happen again. And he was the type of person or the type of cop that if they were giving away a free meal, he wasn't going to turn that down, or even that initial theme that carried through with his shoes. I don't think I'm giving away too much with that one.
That's not a spoiler.
Yeah, he gets a free pair of shoes that the shoemaker gave him a bad pair of shoes that were, really uncomfortable. And he needed a new pair of shoes, and getting a free pair of shoes probably was a make or break financial decision for him back then. And to put him in that place and time, but then he does change. He really does change as a person. and we won't get into why he changed, but you go read the book to find out where he changed, and you can feel a real change had come through to him. He didn't become Mother Teresa after it, I'm sure, but his outlook on life and maybe something in that hardened heart of his did genuinely change. Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors.
Yeah, Amherst is a character that's very polarizing because, like, early readers, like, we both employ, we don't employ them. We both use volunteers who are beta readers, and they are, they're super readers. They're people who would buy the book if they weren't a beta reader, right? They're fans, but they're friends, and they are very critical, but they're on your side, right? They're pretty important to making the end result be as good as it can possibly be. And I got to tell you, beta readers, especially women, hated Amherst. Oh, they hated him. I mean, they hated him so much that we actually softened him a little bit from the first draft. He was worse in the first draft than he is in the actual book. But we didn't soften him to the point of making him likable. We just made him salvageable because he does go through his character arc. He does go through a little bit of a positive change before the end of the book. And I don't think that's too much of a spoiler, but he was just despised by readers. And I mean, one of the earliest drafts that we shared with anybody, I shared with my wife, and she told me, if I wasn't reading this for you, I would have put this down. That's how much I hate George Amherst, which is what convinced us.
Wow.
Convinced us to soften him up a little bit so that nobody would feel like I can't continue to read this. But we're okay with them hating him. They should hate him, or at least not like him. Because he's entitled. He feels entitled, right? He went through all of the things. See, like you're more sympathetic to him than a lot of readers have been, because I think, you're a history guy. And so, why he's the way he is. You can see the reasons why he's the way he is with the war and the Depression and starting policing in a time where there was no question that the reason you're getting a free meal is because you can't really afford to go buy one. So it's either you don't get lunch while you're on duty, or somebody decides they're going to take care of the local cop, and Frank's place will feed him on lunch on Wednesday, and Steve's place will feed him lunch on Thursday. And it was a community support sort of thing. And then it eventually evolved into something a little more insidious or a little more nefarious and such. But he came up in that sort of an environment. So he felt entitled to those shoes, even though he needed them, because he probably, if he bought shoes, that meant he wasn't going to buy something else. I mean, he was living close enough to the dollar that was the case. But he felt entitled. He feels entitled to the free meals. He feels entitled to the free drinks. Whereas Pierce, who's a generation later in policing, he's not going to rock the boat necessarily, but doesn't mean he has to take part in the paddling, and so or the rowing, and so he doesn't take some of the graft that is just standard operating procedure, and it's a point of contention between the two of them. But it also shows that policing is changing. It's starting to a little bit. It's no longer, they're getting paid a little bit more now in 1951, and they can own a home and so forth, and so they don't need the free meals necessarily, but it's part of the culture, and so they expect it. At least Amherst does. So yeah, I enjoyed Amherst. The shoes thing, that was all Colin's idea. We have a process where we outline by chapter and even sometimes by scene, and it's a narrative outline we just kind of have that we both have access to, and we know, like, okay, I'm going to write these 3 scenes and then I'll send it to you and stuff, and those scenes might have included the fact that they get the case and that they go meet the parents of the missing girl, and they go check out the first location that they think she might be, or that somebody who might know something is at. It's a very straightforward outline in that regard. And so he started that, and he sent, because I wrote the initial the Wardell Clint Baumgartner first tentpole scene, the first Mortal Thoughts moment, and so when I get that back from him, that first chapter with Amherst, it's got this stuff in here about the shoes and him being ticked off about the shoes are too tight. This cobbler gave me, bad shoes, and he probably did it on purpose. He's got a German surname, and, he's got 2 wars worth of reasons for hating the Germans, even though he didn't go to war in World War II. He certainly, doesn't like the Germans as a result of this. And so there's a very, not very casual racism going on there, or certainly nationalism. And I thought it was awesome. That's the fun thing about writing with somebody else, is they throw these ideas in that support the idea that you came up with and the structure that you've put in place, but now it's additional details that you didn't discuss that are just a pleasant surprise. And so this whole shoe thing came up, and it was a really great way to show rather than tell, what kind of character Amherst was. The fact that he had this, sense of entitlement and the abrasive way that he deals with it and everything tells us a lot about him, shows us rather than tells us. And so I'm glad you picked up on that. It was very purposeful and certainly a lot of fun to work on that character and to eventually redeem him, which is another piece that I wanted to throw out. And that is, this happens in police work, and I bring it up a lot in the leadership courses that I teach, but I think it's true in human nature, across professions. And that is, we like to put people in a nice little box, a nice little cubicle, a nice little, like to put a jacket on them and say that's who they are. And sometimes they earn that. There are people that I knew who came on the job, and in their early career, they were kind of buffoons. They're kind of a little bit idiots, and they got a reputation for that. And so they got a jacket. I can think of one person in particular who was kind of a goof. And then he got promoted to sergeant, and we were like, oh my God, this is going to be horrible. This guy, and it turns out he was a pretty good sergeant. That was a job he was good at, and he took care of his people. He knew his stuff, and, all of the goof stuff that we had this jacket that we gave him, never really panned out quite as much in that role. And so my point is just that, we don't want to allow people the opportunity to evolve. I want to decide that Steve's an egghead beekeeper, and that's what I want to think forever. Mm-hmm. And I don't even want to allow for the fact that, well, wait a minute, he's been the producer of this podcast for, and another podcast, and then another podcast for like 10 years now. And he's got this creative and aspect to him. And he's a talented interviewer or whatever. None of that. I don't want to think about any about that, because I got my jacket on you. You're the egghead beekeeper. That's what you are. And we didn't want that to be the case with any of these characters. And so even Amherst, who is a royal jerk for a good portion of that first segment, he's capable of change, because we all are. And we might not all elect to change drastically, but we're all capable of it. And if Amherst can actually change even just a little bit, even just the degrees that you saw, then anybody can.
It gets into that corruption that we've talked about in the past episodes. And I think it really plays into here that Amherst, he's the type of, we have to develop these systems. Like you had said that, about when you were on the shift, that there was a neighborhood gas station that would give coffee to cops so that they would write their papers there, and then or write your reports there. But then that could lead to a corruption, even though it was back then a quarter or a 50-cent cup of coffee. But then this is something, because I'm I would say down the line, a pretty strict person with like corruption and that sort of thing. But there was also a community aspect to that you want to support the cop. You want to give a cop a free meal or a discounted meal. And even like nowadays, my daughter works at a restaurant and they have a law enforcement discount, and there's a cop and he doesn't even take it because they don't want to look like they're supporting that. But obviously we want to support the police. But then there's also this thing that you have the George Amhersts who might hit that one restaurant up every, 3 or 4 days, and they don't want to support you that much. Or you have that cop who goes to the Starbucks maybe to get his free coffee, and instead of getting his one coffee maybe every week, he goes through that line 3 or 4 times a night. It's almost like people ruin what we're trying to. We can't have nice things.
Yeah, people want to be supportive. They don't want to support you.
Yeah.
and the reality is that most law enforcement officers are paid a pretty decent salary. It varies across the country, and some are higher than others for sure. There's a lot of disparity from even within a single state, from agency to agency. But we're not at the times that Amherst saw, where he was wondering what dinner was going to be that night if he could, he had to figure that out because there wasn't anything in the cupboard. That just isn't happening as much in most places in the country. Not that there aren't some places that are severely underpaid and understaffed and under-equipped. That's certainly true. But it comes down to it's a big question of ethics, right? If it's a gift that's given that's not a very substantial gift and it's merely to express support, you're probably not going to enter into any sort of ethical quandary there. But the expectation of a quid pro quo is where you definitely are. But it can develop, we've talked before about noble cause corruption. It can develop from very small things. The place that offers 25-cent coffee for cops to stay awake on the road, that was part of the motivation. They don't want people crashing. And they gave it to the ambulance drivers and the bread drivers and the taxi drivers too. Anybody who's driving at night, but it was mostly targeting the cops. And hey, if you come in and get your 25-cent a cup of coffee and you knock out a couple of reports and you're there for 30 minutes on a break/working break, odds of somebody walking in and sticking the place up while you're sitting there are exceedingly low. And so there is a benefit that there's a quid pro quo that's occurring there a little bit. Is that unethical? I don't think so, but you could make that argument. And certainly it's something that we have discussed in leadership classes when we get to the ethics portion of the course. But now imagine that the owner comes in every morning and says, "Hey guys, how's it going?" And then he goes in the back and he does his books or whatever. And so they know who the owner is of this place. And now he gets stopped for a DUI. Does he expect that you're going to give him a break? Do you want to give him a break because he's a good guy and he's treated you well? The human response is yes, but is that ethical? Even just stepping back to the previous scenario, I'm in there for half an hour writing my reports, and I'm there every night for half an hour writing my reports. And so they're getting half an hour of coverage, essentially, of protection. And the Texaco half a mile away is getting 0. Is that fair? Is that ethical? I'm not saying it is unfair, and I'm not saying it is unethical. I'm saying those are questions that if you examine it from an objective viewpoint, you have to ask. But it's all happening in the human arena, right? And so, it's not, we're not robots, and neither is the public. And so the answer isn't always clear cut. Now, somebody giving you, $100 to not book them into jail, that's a different story, right? That's, or cops shaking people down for protection money or something. That's obviously not good. That's obviously criminal. That's obviously an ethics violation or whatever. Those are the easy ones. The deep water is very easy to spot, but it's when you're in the shallow end of the ethics pool that you have to, ask yourself, is this ethical or isn't it? And different people in different areas of the country will differ. I've taught the ethics lesson in the leadership course all over the US and Canada, from coast to coast and from north to south. And I will tell you that where the threshold is for behavior, when it comes to what a cop should feel comfortable accepting without the expectation of quid pro quo differs greatly, based on the culture of the area. And so, and I think it's changed over time, which is what we try to capture in this book. We try to capture that, nobody was batting an eye at Amherst taking free meals in 1951, but the way he was being a jerk about it, sometimes people gave a little side eye, and that's where it's at. By the time we get to 1974, Pierce has a very different view of it that he passes on to his young rookie. And you have to remember, by the time you get to 1974, this is post Serpico, right? This is post Knapp Commission stuff that you're very familiar with. And so it's definitely the culture at large has changed in how they view these things.
One of the things that I was thinking about as I read it is I don't really know anything about Spokane. And if you could give somebody I started to do a little research on it, and I don't know if this is accurate or not, but I kind of got the sense that by 1974, Spokane was like full into, even though it's not in the Rust Belt, I kind of got a little bit of a Rust Belt feeling from it, that it had seen better days, but it also was a college town, so it had a really rich element to it, but it maybe had an element that was on the downward decline. I'm from Buffalo, New York originally, and I kind of got a little bit of a Buffalo feeling from it. Is that accurate? Also with there was the World's Fair that was going on in 1974, which was the backdrop to that set of scenes, that the World's Fair felt a little kind of sad to me, like they were trying to capture something of an excitement to this town that wasn't quite happening anymore. Is any of that accurate at all? Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
Well, I mean, I was 6 years old in 1974, so my view of what was going on in 1974 is obviously full of cartoons and breakfast cereal. So I have to look at it historically, just like you have to look at it from a distance. So I will say that, Spokane is an interesting city in that it's not a city that has often had a singular driving industry, like Detroit had the auto industry, like Seattle has Boeing or Microsoft. Pittsburgh had the steel industry, this kind of thing. I don't know, what was it in Buffalo? I'm sure there was something in Buffalo. Mm-hmm. 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 So there wasn't anything big like that. And so it was always kind of struggling a little bit financially. I think it was trying to kind of make it work with the sum of parts rather than the whole being the driving force. I mean, there was an aluminum plant when I was younger, in the 80s and 90s, Kaiser Aluminum, that employed a goodly number of people, but still wasn't to the degree of something like what we're talking about. And so it's always been a lower, kind of to my thinking, it's always been kind of a lower middle class city. I mean, not that there aren't people in that are wealthy, and there's not people in the upper middle class, but it always felt like the mean or the median income was kind of lower middle class, kind of rough and tumble in a lot of the town, many parts of the town, and so that was kind of the culture of the town. And then the World's Fair was sort of, I always viewed it as the town trying to take the next step, to being maybe a little bit, the next rung on the ladder in terms of, city status. And that was a big deal to host the World Fair. And it had a huge impact on the city. I mean, they built the Riverfront Park to accommodate it. The pavilion that they built for it is still there. They hired a ton of cops to deal with the influx of people, and to the degree that those folks that were hired after the fair ended, a lot of them were laid off, and then the police department basically didn't hire anybody for a couple of years. They just brought people in back from the layoff list. And when I came on, in 93, a lot of those 74 hires were getting ready to retire. And so it was a little bit of the changing of the guard starting to happen. But the other thing about Spokane, and I write about this in the River City series as well, is it's very patchwork. I mean, you could have a neighborhood and in a lot of places in the town where, one or two blocks might be really solidly middle class, really nice yards. People own their homes, neighborhoods very integrated with each other. People know their neighbors and all that. And then you could go over a couple of blocks and it, you're going to have some beat up yards and broken fences and peeling paint coming off of rental houses, and people maybe aren't quite as communal or not as much of a community there, within 4 or 5 blocks of each other. It's not like in some cities where it's like, hey, when you cross this street, you're now in this neighborhood and this is the fabric of that neighborhood for the most part. It's much more pocketed and segmented in this small little patchwork, like a quilt almost, across large swaths of the city, especially the north side is that way. But even the south side, which, historically was where a lot of the wealth resided, the neighborhoods nearer to downtown were still a little more lower middle class too. So even that had some patchwork to it, but it was so it's an interesting dynamic because, you can't just say, well, I work Northwest. And then that means you're dealing with this, segment of people in terms of socio-economic status or racial makeup or both. It doesn't matter. You work in the northwest part of town. Okay, you might get sent into the west central neighborhood where it's kind of poor and a lot of rentals, and then drive 8 blocks and you're into some pretty luxurious houses that were turn of the century mansions, and people living there making 6 figures. So it's kind of weird in that regard. I don't know if I've not seen that very common across the country. It seems to be fairly unique to Spokane. And so it's part of the character of the city.
There's a great quote that I'd like to share, and I think it really summarizes the whole book. I think for me, at least, it was what I took as the big theme of the book. And I think that this is a good way to wrap up, and maybe you can tell us a little bit of what you and Colin's perspective is on this quote. It was in one of the tentpole scenes between the Wardell Clint and the former Chief Baumgartner, where Wardell Clint says, people in power don't get to make the truth be what they want it to be. And then Chief Baumgartner replies, they do it all the time. It's called history. And I thought that was absolutely brilliant on so many levels, because there's so many people, historians, who think that they're dealing in a science, that there's an objective truth. And we just see it in this one little thing of there is really, the truth is told. Yeah, there are certain things that are objective facts, but when you're telling a story, you get a story through a person's perspective, and that person has a whole laundry list of incentives to tell the story in a certain way. And then that story gets reinterpreted through a whole set of incentives. Mm-hmm. And I'd love to hear what the two of you were thinking when you developed that theme and that idea that got so perfectly encapsulated in just 2 lines.
Yeah, we were thinking about it a lot. It goes back to that idea of nuance and having there be shades of gray rather than black and white. And I mean, this is a story, about a search for a killer over 3 generations of cops, 4 if you want to count Clint, who's pulling at strings in 2023, and the mistakes that can occur and the social pressures that force people to handle things a certain way. And it's a mystery. They're trying to figure out, is this the same guy? Is this a different guy? Is it, is this guy that guy, in a different, is he wearing a disguise essentially? Is he, there's all these mysterious questions going on. And yet, those tentpole scenes make it clear that this is Baumgartner telling Clint a story. I mean, you get it in narrative form, and we cheat. You get to get inside the head of Amherst. I mean, Baumgartner doesn't know what Amherst was thinking about his shoes, and this kind of stuff. I mean, it's a storytelling mechanism. But if you get to the end of the book and you look back and go, okay, this is what happened, you have to realize, well, no, not entirely. This is what Amherst told Pierce, who told Salter, who told Baumgartner, who also experienced some of it, who's now telling Clint, who's interpreting it. And as you mentioned, every one of those tellings, is told through the filters of bias and both implicit and explicit. And so it's a big game of telephone to a degree too. And certainly because we tell it the way we tell it, because we do get into the heads of the characters, we don't limit ourselves to just what Baumgartner could have known. We get around that a little bit, but at the end of it all, that's what you've got. And the idea that, that the police sometimes are faced with hard decisions about what to release to the public and what to tell the public in what's best for the public good versus what's ethical to share, and when is the truth more harmful than a comfortable lie? When is a lie dangerous, and when is a lie, a gift? I mean, we don't go through this entire world without telling a falsehood. None of us do, and sometimes we tell what they term white lies, or lies of omission to spare people's feelings. But we're making a decision when we do that. We make a choice when we do that, right? I mean, whether we tell the truth or not, or don't, let something out, lie of omission. I remember a friend of mine one time told the story of a relative of his, an uncle, I think it was, who had an affair, like about 5 or 6 years into the marriage, and like 25, 26 years go by, and they stayed married, and he felt guilty about it. And so after all those years of feeling guilty, he finally told his wife about the affair. And I remember my friend was mad at him. He was like, you should have told her right away or not at all. That was his opinion. And of course, other people would probably argue that, he should tell her the truth. And that's for you to decide as an individual where you fall on that. But it's kind of a similar sort of thing. I mean, do you tell the public, what really happened? Or do you let them live with a comfortable truth or a comfortable lie that isn't going to hurt them? Probably, and how do you decide, and who gets to decide? What gives you the authority to decide? And are you merely getting a chance to decide by virtue of your position? Nobody said that was something that you get to do, but the circumstances are such that now you do. And so then you have to decide if you even have the right to make that decision. And there's disagreement within the book from different people as to the answers to those questions. And it all comes to a head, a couple of times actually. And I think that those kinds of questions are interesting, and it's fun to have, circling back to your true crime versus fiction question from earlier in the episode. It's fun to be able to have characters who feel differently about it and can voice both sides, or, more than both sides, multiple sides of that question, and explore it more deeply. And then ultimately it's the reader to, they get to decide at the end is, who was right. And then what the cops eventually did, was that right? Or was it for the best, or was it corruption, or was it a noble act, or what? And as a writer, those are fun things. I mean, I get in trouble sometimes because I do that a little more frequently than some writers, and people like hard and fast answers, like the good guy won, the bad guy lost, and that this is what happened. And I'll write stories or books sometimes where I don't know who you would say the good guy is and who the bad guy is here. Like, surely the killer is the bad guy, but besides that, it's a little bit more nuanced. And I'll write stories sometimes where I don't entirely tell you what happened. I lead you to believe what probably did, but there's room for interpretation. And man, I'll get notes from readers for sure. People like things a little more clear cut, but too bad Those aren't the stories
Yeah.
I always want to tell. And I don't think you can tell a story like this that is this nuanced in terms of, across all this time period and all the changes that took place. And I mean, it's just not a black and white story. And so you can't tell it that way.
Exactly. Even if they did tell the entire truth, what is the entire truth? Yeah, there is one thing that happened, but there was a whole web of other things that had happened all around it that were connected, that weren't connected. And does your average person, need to know all that? And then do they really care about all of that? And then what is actually putting out all this information even really mean? What is it? Is there going to be a story in the newspaper? Is there going to be a report or a commission on this sort of thing? It's the feeling that there has to always be this absolute truth, like there's a book of truth out there that we can just inscribe in there. This is the story of what really happened. It just isn't that black and white.
And you have a different need or desire based on who you are. I mean, there are people in the community who are like, look, I don't care. I just want to know one thing. Is it safe for my kids to walk to school today? Are bad guys getting put in jail without their rights being, mauled? And are my kids safe? Is my house going to get broken into tonight? And if the answer is yes, they're safe, and no, it won't be, then that's really all I care about. Now, if you go crazy and you start kicking in doors and robbing drug dealers and stuff, that's not what we're talking about here. But if you're an investigative journalist at the local newspaper, I think you have a different answer to that equation. And so that's kind of what we wanted to explore. Obviously it's fun to try to solve the mystery. And how things went with that changed as that story developed, as we wrote and rewrote it. And we had a lot of discussions about resolution, particularly deeper into the book, and how to handle it and stuff. It was a lot of conversations and kicking things around and trying to stay true to the characters and true to the times and true to the questions that we were asking. And that was a wonderful experience, maddening at times, frustrating at times, but in a good way. I have a really good relationship with Colin, and we can have really hard conversations without hard feelings. And that's a good friendship and a good partnership when you can do that. But in addition to telling a story and solving a mystery, we wanted to explore this other gray area that you're talking about. And I think if people read the book, you can read it as a murder mystery, as a police procedural, and it stands up. I mean, it has to. That's its primary function. And if you don't want to get into the noise of the other questions, then, you read through them and make up your mind and move on. But if you're also one of those folks who likes to really think about the books that you read, there's plenty of meat on the bone for that kind of reader too.
Yeah, if I had to leave the people with the thought is that if you love a whodunit, there's that element there. There's everything you want. There's red herrings. There's following the evidence. There's every bit of that. But I think that layer on top that connects it and also connects it through to even though you don't have to read the other books in the series, and I haven't read them yet. I have them on my Kindle and it's ready to go. But there's all these little Easter eggs that you might call them that you're getting connected into a bigger story. And I think that added a lot of texture to the story. And it probably would be, I guarantee it would be a lot better if you read the other books. I've read a ton of series and I love that, where they're dropping in little hints and clues towards other parts of the story. But in this case, you don't have to read them to have read them to get that texture that this is a part of a bigger universe. It's not just this flat thing that exists in this book alone.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Anybody who's read the first 5 books will see a ton of connections. Certainly, characters that are in those first books show up at the appropriate place in their career at the appropriate times in this book. But it is, The Silence of the Dead can be read as a complete standalone as well. And in fact, I originally conceived it as that. And then once I got to thinking about it, I realized it would mesh really well with the Charlie 316 universe and should be part of it. And then that's why I took it to Colin and we fleshed it out in that way. But yeah, and I'm glad, Steve, that you keyed on that particular quote about people making the truth what they need it to be, and how that's history. That comeback, because that's a piece that really resonated for us as well. Is people deciding what things are going to mean and then acting upon that, and who gets to decide, and what powers push it that direction, and so forth. We use a lot of quotes at the beginning of sections in these books, and some of them are real. And then in some of the books, some of the quotes actually come from characters from within the series. So we play fast and loose with that a little bit, but I can tell you that this particular quote, if we write any more Chart 316 books, if it's ever relevant, it'll be a quote we'll pull out and use again, because it is a thematically important one.
Yeah, so I'll just leave it today that I highly recommend people go read the book and listen to this conversation as well, because I think it would definitely spur you to think a little bit more. And if you have thoughts about the book or what we talked about the book, definitely come and join the conversation. Links to how to buy Frank's books will be all in the show notes. And reach out if you have questions or comments, and we'll definitely talk to you next time.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me, Steve. This has been a lot of fun. This book has been close to my heart for over a decade, so having it be out in the world and getting the chance to talk with you about it has been very satisfying.